Um, Ladies and gentlemen, and our audience online, welcome to our the 32nd leading edge talk. Today we are very honored to have Professor Wendy Hui Kyong Chun to give us a talk on her most recent work on digital democracy. And Professor Wendy Chun is Simon Fraser University's Canada 150 Research Chair in New Media in the School of Communication and also Director of Digital Democracies Institute. She has studied both system design engineering and English literature, which she combines and mutates in her research on digital media. She has authored many books, including Control and Freedom, Power and Paranoia in the Age of Fiber Optics, 2006, Program Visions, Software and Memory, 2011, Updating to Remain the Same, Habitual New Media, 2016, and most recently, Discriminating Data, Correlation, Neighborhoods, and the New Politics of Recognition. All these above mentioned 4 books were published by MIT Press. Really heavyweight and leading edge research. She has been professor and chair of the Department of Modern Culture and Media at Brown University, where she worked for almost 2 decades and is currently a visiting professor. She is a fellow in Royal Society of Canada and has also held fellowships from the Guggenheim, ACLS, American Academy of Berlin, Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard. And I met Professor Wendy Chun at a conference, I think last year in April. The conference was organized by the National Humanities Center in the USA, and at the conference she gave a very, very powerful and enlightening talk on how the artificial intelligence actually helped to produce this echo chamber effect, where our ideologies concerning identity is being reinforced and contribute to this increasing infectious and polarizing societal atmosphere. And so and also her background is very interesting. I think she was initially an engineering major, and then she switched to do a PhD in English. And so, and this background is especially, I think, inspiring for people who currently are working in the humanities, because this kind of interdisciplinary work is, I think, especially urgent for our times, where the use of artificial intelligence is dominating our life right now. So how to turn artificial intelligence into something that's positive for our living is I think, an issue we all have to consider, whether you're working in the humanities or in engineering or other fields. So we're very honored again to have Professor Wendy Chun here. And without further ado, let's welcome Professor Wendy Chun. Please.
Thank you so much for the introduction and for inviting me here. I'm very excited to be with you here and to be part of this incredible series that you've organized. Just to double check, can everyone see my screen? Yes, perfect. I can see it behind you, so I presume that that's what's being projected. Great. So today, I want to think with you as you take on the really large issue of AI and humanity. The topic of AI and humanity, of course, is huge. It's huge and it provokes a lot of anxiety as well as techno-optimism. And what's key is this anxiety and techno-optimism precede and greatly amplify the actual powers of current technology. So from 1980s Hollywood films, which were themselves based on 1960s science fiction, to more recent warnings by scientists and entrepreneurs that AI's dawn equals humanity's dusk. And here you see Stephen Hawking's warning about the coming singularity. And the coming singularity, or the notion of the singularity, was actually conceptualized by John von Neumann in the mid-20th century. And it's no accident that people who have been so intensely involved with technology are those who are most fearful of it. What you see as well is Musk, perhaps paradoxically and intriguingly, warning us both of AI and threats to democracy. These warnings coincide, of course, with promises about AI's dawn, right? So AI has been sold to us as something that's good. It's something that's good because it will end inequality. It'll end inequality by creating tireless, docile, and smart servants. So we've been told AI will spread the perks of the 1%, perks such as chauffeurs, personal assistants, expert advisors, to the 90%. Now, what's key is that these dreams and nightmares are two sides of the same coin. They're obverses rather than opposites. And they're obverses because they both presume a master-slave relationship between AI and humanity. And indeed, fears of and hopes for servants or slaves becoming masters are at least as old as Hegel. And not surprisingly, many people have pointed out the limitations of this position. Right, so Gilbert Simondon in 1958 argued that there's human reality in technical reality. And as you see in the part that I've highlighted here, he called for the abolition of technical objects. More recently, Jenny Rhee has revealed the profoundly raced and gendered relations that underpin what she calls the robotic imaginary. And these are very much linked to questions of labor. Indigenous scholars and designers such as Jason Lewis and other authors of the Indigenous Protocol have sought to rethink this master-slave relationship. So they've called on us to make kin with our machines and argued what's key is rethinking the relationship between machines and humans. And what all of these writers do is trouble the and in AI and humanity. And crucially, and both conjoins and disjoins. So and as a conjunction implies that the terms it joins are both similar, but at the same time different. The terms, in other words, are non-identical. Now, this work I've pointed out is key, and I'm happy to discuss it during the question and answer period. But today I want us to consider another take on the and. Because what I want us to consider is how the humanities have been called on to both defer the nightmare and keep the dream alive in troubling ways. So I'll start with a cautionary tale about interdisciplinary work. But even as I start with a cautionary tale about interdisciplinary work, I want to make it absolutely clear that my cautionary tale isn't a dismissal. As I tell my students all the time, critique isn't about finding something you disagree with and dismissing it. It's not about finding flaws in something so you can therefore ignore it going forward. Critical thinking for me and the work that I tried to do is about grappling with and carefully studying what I think is both true and important. So it's analyzing and creatively engaging with what you're intrigued by, what you're beguiled by, and what you're passionate about. And it's also analyzing and creatively engaging with what you simply accept as defaults, what you simply accept as true or common sense. And so I've spent my entire career, as was pointed out in the introduction, working across disciplines. I've been very much around the disciplinary block. An undergrad in engineering, a PhD in English Lit. I worked for decades in the humanities and arts, and now I'm a social scientist. So it's in this spirit of sympathetic critique and the urgency and the need for interdisciplinary work and the acknowledgement that this interdisciplinary work is both hard and troubling, that I want us to consider what I've been calling humanities washing. And it's humanities washing with a question mark, because it really is a question for me. So usually the humanist, we're invited to tech meetings in the US to shake things up a little. We look different, we speak different, we're considered to be a little exotic. And we're usually asked to talk about ethics or responsibility. So we talk about the ethical implications of technology, for example, the ethics or not of user capture or surveillance. We talk about responsible AI, so how AI can be used responsibly to promote democratic engagement. And what we've been considering is thinking about responsibility, not simply as the application of rules, but again, this notion that you face responsibility when your rules fail you. So responsive AI systems. We're also called on to discuss and think through discrimination. So how current technologies perpetuate inequalities. And the example par excellence that we all talk about within the United States is COMPAS. So for all of you unfamiliar with COMPAS, it's a software program used by some US courts to predict the risk of recidivism. So this is a software program that allegedly tells you or offers a score of how likely you are to commit another crime. What happens is that inmates and law enforcement are given a questionnaire to fill out. COMPAS reads the answers and then spits out a score based on the inputs. And judges then factor these scores into their sentencing and parole decisions. Now, the problem is that COMPAS has been shown to discriminate against racial minorities. Many groups have in fact sued COMPAS for being biased against Black Americans. And here you see the cover of the award-winning ProPublica article on COMPAS. Now, these conversations and working across disciplines are important. And again, I'm committed to these conversations. I lead an institute, the Digital Democracies Institute, that brings together folks in the humanities, the data sciences and engineering, social sciences, policy and industry, as well as nonprofits, to take on some of the hard problems we face. Problems such as disinformation, abusive language, and discriminatory algorithms. And we work across disciplines and sectors because we have to. So we work across disciplines and sectors because no one discipline or sector has solved or indeed can solve these problems. we work across disciplines and sectors because we do different things, not because we do the same things. And we work across discipline and sectors because if we do things right, one discipline's roadblock becomes another starting point. So most bluntly, we work across disciplines and sectors, even though we make each other a little uncomfortable, and making each other uncomfortable is key. We work across disciplines and sectors because we need each other. And we need each other in order to make these problems something other than interesting research problems that never end. Okay, having said this, working across disciplines isn't enough. And simply adding the humanities or critical social sciences or ethics to the conversation might make things more interesting, but it doesn't automatically make them more just or diverse. And tellingly, a lot of folks within the Valley have resisted corporate attempts to introduce ethic boards or human-centered AI. And human-centered AI, of course, is another buzzword that predominated in the Valley for a while. So what you see here is the fact that employees who are really nestled in the belly of the desert beast have protested the introduction of ethics boards. And they've protested not because they're against ethics, but because they're for ethics. Right? They've protested because these boards tend to include some really shady people whose ethical credentials are at best dubious. Also, if the goal is, and this is often stated as the goal of these ethics boards and human-centered AI, if the goal is to think broadly and diversely about tech and its impact on humanity, if the goal is to broaden tech development beyond the insular Valley culture, beyond the 1.8 thousand square miles of California desert, I mean, this is a very small geographical area, it's not clear that these folks are best equipped to do so. And many people have viewed this, especially if you think through who's on this list here, same stuff, different pile. And this is why 2019 was known as the year of ethics washing. And ethics washing, for all of you unfamiliar with the term, refers to endless conversations about ethics and AI, endless conversations about morals and technology, endless conversations that repeatedly uncover and discuss what's painfully obvious, right? The painfully obvious adverse effects of tech. And by doing so, effectively forestall action and regulation, hence ethics washing. Now, this ethics washing can also entail humanities washing. And in humanities washing, humanities clean tech and tech bleaches the humanities. And increasingly, tech companies are reaching out to the humanities for help with their ethics problems. And humanities departments who are often facing their own issues are very happy to help. And here you see a really great new effort by the National Humanities Council, a really fantastic organization to create responsible AI curriculum. Now, to be clear, we need courses like this. We need the humanities and responsibility to be integrated into engineering courses. So growing up in engineering, we had one ethics course, and that was quite frankly a joke. But all of us were questioning what was happening and wanted to do the right thing. So we would have loved courses like this. And we need courses like this. But we also, again, need to pause. We need to pause because efforts to add the humanities as arbiters of ethics disturbingly coincide with efforts by these very same companies to sideline unruly, diverse workers. And it also frames the problems with technology as problems of education, as problems of individual ignorance. So what this implies is that solutions will come with time. Once these engineers, once these humanities plus engineers have graduated. But humanities washing doesn't just inadvertently kick the can down the line, it can also bleach the humanities. So in a lot of these intro to ethics course, what's taught isn't that diverse or representative of current work in the humanities. So here you see the great fathers of ethics in the humanities, Kant, Bentham, Aristotle, and Mill. And often these are the only 4 people who are taught in these courses. Now, clearly their work is important, and thinking with and through utilitarianism, thinking with and through morals and virtue is important. But equally important are theorists such as Gayatri Spivak and Achille Mbembe, theorists who address the possibilities and limits of ethics and responsibility, who address the relationships between ethics and violence, reason and post-coloniality. But they're not included in textbooks on ethics in tech or textbooks on responsible AI. And here you see a summary of ethics from Victoria Dignam's really excellent book on responsible AI. And you'll see here that in her summary, she draws from Bentham, Aristotle, and Mill. And drawing from Bentham, Aristotle, and Mill, it shouldn't be surprising that she argues that we need to move beyond ethics to what she calls responsible AI. And responsible AI, for her, is all about application and participation by everyone. Now, the thinkers Dignam doesn't engage are thinkers who have produced recent and excellent critical texts on inequality, responsibility, and tech. So what we're seeing is that calls for ethical or responsible tech can inadvertently silence or drown out a lot of good work, because a lot of people are calling from the same things without listening to each other. So if this is so, what can we do? So these excellent efforts don't become forms of humanities washing. Well, what I'll suggest for the rest of the talk today is that to avoid this, we need to start by 1, realizing that if the humanities and critical social sciences are helpful, which I think they are, right? So if the humanities and social sciences are helpful, it's not because they're better. It's not because they're inherently more ethical or diverse, but rather, if the humanities and critical social sciences are helpful, it's because they've been struggling with these issues for a while now. And it's from these struggles that these books emerge. So critical theory, indigenous studies, ethnic studies, feminism, so many areas can help us because and when they don't portray the humanities as inherently ethical or good, even as they insist on them as necessary. So that's one thing. The second thing is we have to realize that, as so many researchers have pointed out, the problem with tech isn't that it's outside of culture or society or politics. The problem isn't that tech is outside of these things, but rather that it's shot through with them, right? So think again of Simondon's description. More particularly in terms of AI and humanity, the problem isn't that tech doesn't borrow from the humanities and social sciences, or the humanities and social sciences don't borrow from tech, but rather that they borrow badly from each other. Which brings me to part 2, the social science founders effect. So to think through how tech, humanities, and social sciences borrow badly from each other, how they ground each other as first principles, I want us to think through the socio-cultural history of two fundamental concepts, homophily and correlation. So to start with homophily, many of you might not be familiar with this term. Homophily is the notion that similarity breeds connection, that birds of a feather flock together. Homophily, literally love of the same, grounds social media networks, network science, and recommender systems. So you experience homophily all the time, whenever websites encourage you to buy, to listen to, or to click on things that people like you have bought, listened to, or click on. But not everything you like, buy, or listen to is weighted equally. Your most valuable likes are likes that are slightly strange or controversial. So for instance, liking Harry Potter is pretty innocuous. You might really like Harry Potter, but liking it, so many people like it, that information is not valuable. Liking something like Napoleon Dynamite, that's valuable. And early on, within recommender system algorithms, likes were weighted by controversy. And the hate button was weighted far more heavily than the like button. Because it's these sort of odd likes or intense hatreds. These odd likes or intense hatreds, they're assumed to be authentic. And we're constantly called on to be authentic online by revealing some intimate yet open secret about us. Some intimate yet open secret about us that makes us different, makes us think different from others, but as you can see here, like others. So make us different from some others, but like others. And these open secrets are valuable because they're used to break masses into clusters. They're used to put us into network neighborhoods with others who are like us, others who agitate and charge us, others who make us act more predictably because what we act to are triggers. And the example that I always use that you can see here is the classic high school iron filing and magnet experiment. So I'm sure you've all done this. You take a magnet and you put it under a piece of paper with a mass of iron filings. And what emerges, as you can see here, is a network. So what emerges are gaps, poles and clusters, clusters of attraction and repulsion. So if you think through what's at the north and the south poles, right, these clusters form because they're attracted to their opposite. And this attraction both overcomes and produces repulsion. So in a network, sameness repulses and agitates. And this is really interesting because homophily is usually justified in terms of comfort. Homophily is usually justified because you're supposedly more comfortable with people like you. But as Facebook whistleblower Frances Haugen has shown, homophily produces agitation and greater stress. It creates what I've called agitated clusters of comforting rage, right? It creates communities under stress. And these network neighborhood models are also so insidious because even as they promote difference, right? So think different, even as they promote difference, they also presume that neighborhoods should be segregated, that your neighbor should be like you. So if we manage to finally love our neighbors as ourselves, it's because they've literally become like ourselves. Now, not surprisingly, US residential neighborhoods are often given as evidence of naturally occurring homophily. And here you see the description of homophily used in really one of the best textbooks on network science. And what easily inclined argue here is that one of the most readily perceived effects of homophily is the formation of ethnically and racially homogeneous neighborhoods in cities. Traveling through a metropolitan area, one finds that homophily produces a natural spatial signature. People live near others like them, and as a consequence, they open shops, restaurants, and other businesses oriented towards the populations of their respective neighborhoods. Maybe. But if so, it's because, as many people have shown, US residential segregation isn't an accident. US residential segregation, again, something that's conceived of by easily inclined as something that's naturally occurring, is actually something that was carefully planned and engineered. It was carefully planned and engineered through laws, through highway construction, through race and religion-based covenants, and these covenants restricted who could buy in a certain area, as well as race-based mortgages. So what's key is that homophily, understood this way, launders hate into love. So if you think of what homophily asserts in terms of flocking together, how do you show you love your own? Basically by fleeing when others show up. And homophily has really been used to understand white flight. And what we have to understand is that the links between homophily and US segregation are deep and profound. I had to turn on the light here. Sorry, it's dark in Vancouver and I'm clearly not moving around enough in my office, so the lights will go out. As I was mentioning, the links between homophily and US segregation are deep and profound. And as I'll discuss later, the very term homophily actually came from a study of US biracial public housing. So homophily literally builds from US residential segregation, and it spreads the consequences of US race-based segregation globally through recommender systems, right? And homophily, the term, was coined in a study by the Columbia Bureau of Applied Sociological Research, which was led by sociologists Robert K. Merton and Karl Lazarsfeld. And the goal of Merton and Lazarsfeld in this housing study was to study morale in post-World War II housing projects. And they focused on two housing projects, Crafttown, which is a project which was cooperatively owned of some 700 white families in New Jersey. Crafttown is an alias, and what's important is that Crafttown is still going. It's still an existing cooperative in New Jersey. And Hilltown, so Crafttown is Winfield, New Jersey. And Hilltown, a biracial low-rent project of about 800 families in Western Pennsylvania. So Hilltown was a project in Pittsburgh. Now, early on, and this is something that many people around the world and certainly many Americans don't realize, is that early on, public housing was white only. And the first public housing project in the US was Techwood Homes in Atlanta, Georgia. This again was a whites only project that was built using New Deal money. And it was built by evicting Black residents from the neighborhood. Now, this whites only approach to public housing changed post-World War II. During the post-World War II housing crisis within the United States. And post-World War II, over 70% of Americans, supported public housing. And yet, rather than simply build more public housing, there was a hot debate over what to do. Because developers wanted more private housing like Levittown. And for you unfamiliar with Levittown, they're towns built in the United States, suburbs in which houses look exactly the same, that were carefully planned, and similarly whites only. And they developers wanted government money to create private segregated housing. The developers, of course, won, and as a consequence, there's a huge gap in wealth within the United States today. And this has all been well documented by Ira Katznelson in his really fabulous book, When Affirmative Action Was White. So in response to this debate over public housing, the Columbia researchers conducted a study of these two housing projects. And their goal was to understand the impact of public housing on democratic citizenship, and in particular morale, because they viewed morale as key to citizenship. And at this point in the social sciences, more generally, morale of soldiers, morale of interns, etc., was considered absolutely key to understanding society. And they chose housing projects because they were planned enclosed communities. They were spaces of explicit social engineering and experimentation. And their analysis was very wide-ranging and ambitious. They interviewed one family member of every household, and they asked them questions about privacy, about social engagement, about who they talked to, and most importantly, who their friends were. And they focused on friends because new friendships, they inferred, revealed the impact of social engineering, right? So new friendships were the measurement of the success or not of social engineering. And friendship, in particular, friendship patterns among a select group of white residents, and only white residents, were key to their findings of homophily. So the fact that recommender systems breed polarization shouldn't surprise us, right? Echo chambers and social engineering are a goal, not an error, right? We shouldn't be surprised that social media is based on social engineering or seeks social engineering or echo chambers, because many of the techniques used by social media companies were developed by studying enclosed communities, undergoing explicit social engineering. And I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A how sentiment analysis developed from analyses of women workers and also interned Japanese Americans within camps during World War II. But if we want to think through this borrowing both ways, they also stem from eugenics, and in particular, 20th century attempts to breed better humans. So correlation, linear and logistic regression, linear discriminant analysis, and importantly, correlation, linear and logistic regression, and linear discriminant analysis ground big data, machine learning, and pattern recognition, and the computational social sciences. These stem from 20th century eugenics. And eugenics, of course, has been repudiated as a false science, in particular after the Holocaust. But as many of you, I'm sure, are aware, correlation drives the so-called era of big data. Correlation makes data the new oil. So correlation, we've been told, changes everything. So as Kukier and Myra Schonenberg, for example, have argued, by allowing us to address the entire data set, big data moves us from the why to the how. theory's dead because causality is dead. Instead of causes, we now have actual correlations, actually existing correlations, proxies for certain behaviors that enable us to predict and possess the future. Knowledge enables us to predict and possess the future rather than the past. Maybe. But if knowledge now means knowing the future, it's because in these models, the past and the future coincide. Because structurally speaking, the past and the future are the same things in these models. The past and the future are missing but recreatable values. So if you consider this description of link prediction, what's key is that the future at t+1 is determined in the same ways as missing information in the past, right? So the likely future equals the missing past. And these predictive programs are trained and tested using existing past data. Their ground truth is a highly selective past, not the future. So this means that if this pruned or cleaned past is discriminatory, these models will make discriminatory predictions. But more starkly, it's not simply garbage in or garbage out. More starkly, this means that if the past is discriminatory, they will only be verified as correct if they make discriminatory predictions. So if you think about this, this is the most undisruptive version of the future possible, right? So in this future, there can be no disruption. And again, we shouldn't be surprised because correlation, linear and logistic regression, which is and logistic regression is at the heart of neural nets, were developed by 20th century eugenicists, right? So this isn't correlation's first rodeo. The Pearson correlation coefficient, which is used in many recommender systems to determine similarity, and linear regression were developed as tools to prove the truth of eugenics. They were developed as tools to understand human heredity as history. So history as human heredity and human heredity as history. Sir Francis Galton, who's widely considered the father of eugenics, developed regression, which was first called reversion and correlation, while studying two problems. The problem of inheritance of genius, and the identification of criminals. So as an undergrad, based on his experiences as an undergrad in Cambridge, in which he associated with members of certain famous families, he wanted to understand how genius was and wasn't passed on from generation to generation. So what he sought was a law of inheritance. That is a formula to quantify the contribution of each generation to the next generation. And what's key here is that Galton was a biometrician rather than a Mendelian. So for all of you familiar with that famous debate within early 20th century genetics between biometricians and Mendelians, he was a biometrician. So in other words, he believed that traits were distributed along a normal curve rather than encapsulated within dominant or recessive genes. So exceptions such as genius were statistical outliers and thus located at ends of the curve in the fourth quartile. And Galton developed linear regression, which is now used to determine the best fitting line between scattered points in order to understand the transmission of deviation. So most simply, linear regression assumes a linear relationship between an independent and dependent variable. The classic, as you see here, is y equals mx plus b, where m and b are constants. Once you determine this formula, you can calculate y based on x. So this is now the standard understanding of linear regression. But intriguingly, Galton's conception of linear regression differed in purpose and in order from this now standard procedure. Right? So this procedure, which depends on the least squares method, tries to minimize standard deviation. In contrast, Galton developed linear reversion in order to amplify deviation. So he analyzed the difference in size between sweet peas and their offsprings, and later between human parents of exceptional heights and their offspring. And what he drew a line and sought to determine, as you see here, is not the slope between 2 points on a given graph, but rather of their deviations from the mean. And what he showed, he argued, was that unless carefully bred, deviations decreased over time. And so according to Galton, his graphs proved that offsprings were literally reverting or later regressing to an ancestral mean. And reversion became regression after Carl Pearson. Recall again the Pearson correlation coefficient. Pearson was his disciple. He was a fellow eugenicist and also considered to be one of the fathers of modern statistics. Pearson revised the law of ancestral mean to show that you could change the mean by accentuating deviation. And then once he did, they moved from reversion to regression. But eugenicists were obsessed with racial regression, with the ways that 19th and early 20th century races they thought were degenerating. So the background here is that the English had lost the Boer War, and it was thought they had lost the war because its population was weak. And Galton was distressed to witness the draggled, drudged, mean look of the massive individuals, especially of the women that one meets in the streets of London and other purely English towns. The conditions of their life seemed too hard for their constitutions and to be crushing them into degeneracy. The conditions, of course, are the Industrial Revolution. But according to the eugenicists, the cure for this degeneracy wasn't social programs. So Galton, Pearson, and Sir Ronnie Fisher all believed that social programs were a waste of money because their benefits were limited to one generation. Social programs, as you see here, they argued made a nation and a race weak. It killed civilizations. So that the only solution was better breeding. The selection of parentage, they argued, was the sole effective process by which a race can continuously progress. And eugenics, as Virginia Eubanks has pointed out, entailed massive documentation of the poor and experimentation with human populations. So as Pearson, summarizing Galton, put it, national eugenics aims at showing clearly how much harm is being done by some one course of action and how much good by some other, and how closely connected social practices are with the future vigor of the nation. And they explicitly viewed human history as a space of and for experimentation. So their metaphors were very agricultural. They talked about breeding humans, and they talked about various ancestral lines and marriages as forms of breeding. And in all of this, and this task of figuring out future vigor, correlation was key. Correlation proved the truth of eugenics. As Theodore Porter has argued, correlation was key to biometry. Predicting the consequences of natural selection required a measure of the interactions of organs or traits that tended to vary together. The mathematical tool for studying such interactions, whether among the various organs of a single individual or of a single organ across generations, was correlation. And correlation was key because in their studies of correlation, any and all similarities were interpreted as evidence of nature rather than nurture. So any correlation was considered to be natural. And this is why they argued that in order to create a better future, one had to breed a better human crop. So innate characteristics, rather than learned ones, determine the quality of offspring. And indeed, they went so far as to say that no training or education can create intelligence. It must be bred. And what I hope you can see here is that correlation posits a linear relationship between past, present, and future, one in which environmental changes, which occur over the duration of a lifetime, are thrown away as inconsequential. So correlation is a theory of history as homogeneous empty time, as homogeneous empty natural time. And Pearson's description of the power of correlation eerily repeats claims now made about correlation in terms of big data. And his celebration of correlation in the early 20th century could easily be confused for 21st century proselytizers of big data, as you can see here. But what I want to emphasize is that it's not just Pearson. So SVM, which is a key method to pattern recognition, especially early pattern recognition, was based on linear discriminants, functions that were developed by Sir Ronnie Fisher to, as the name linear discriminants implies, to discriminate between races based on characteristics such as skull size. And skull size indeed was one of the important examples that he drew from. Now, to be absolutely clear, I'm not saying that everyone who uses correlation is a eugenicist. But rather what I am saying is that if the world now seems so closed, it's because these tools were designed to close rather than open the future. And if you think about it, it's really perverse that machine learning draws from concepts developed to show that intelligence couldn't be trained. So social media networks and predictive programs, as they're currently formed and implemented, embed within themselves past mistakes and injustices. Past mistakes and injustices such as segregation, internment, and eugenics. Because in these systems, truth equals consistency, past equals the future. Because in these systems, learning is repetition within certain encouraged standard deviations. So the problem with machine learning as it currently exists isn't simply that it's often trained on dirty or highly selective data. And here I'm talking about predictive machine learning. Of course, Hollywood celebrities lie at the heart of many facial recognition training sets. And here you see the so-called deep fakes produced using the set. The problem isn't simply, as this example makes clear, that ground truth often itself equals deep fake, and we're in deep trouble if Hollywood celebrities and Instagram images are treated as ground truth. But also that these so-called predictive programs are verified as true only if they reproduce this data, right? So to make this clear, let's do a little thought experiment. Okay, so everyone, think of the worst mistake you've made. Think of the worst mistake you've made. Now think of everything you've learned from that mistake. Think of everything that you now do differently. Think of how you think differently or that you aspire to do differently. Now imagine this opportunity to learn, to truly learn, was taken away because your past, your ground truth was that mistake. Or even worse, that your ground truth was a mistake that somebody mistakenly attributed to you. So this is the nightmare scenario of predictive machine learning. But if this is so, what can we do? And in this last section, I want to talk about how we can move from models to gaps. and how we can keep the future open. Because to keep the future open, to create more just and democratic futures, we need to be a little perverse. We need to read the discriminatory results of these algorithms against the grain as evidence of past discrimination, right? So this is one way forward. So to offer you a concrete example, Amazon stopped using its secret hiring AI program a few years ago. And it stopped using the secret hiring AI program because it was shown to discriminate against women. So if you had women anywhere on your CV, like Women Chess Club, etc., you lost points. Now, rather than simply discarding these programs, what if we use them as evidence? So almost every hiring decision that Amazon made during a certain period was probably used to train this program. So what if we thank them for meticulously documenting their discrimination? Think again of Compass. As Barry, Jesser, Castleman, and Goldstein have shown in their analysis for the Marshall Project, although Compass doesn't use overtly racial categories, it uses categories that are proxies for race in the United States. And here you see how race is linked to factors such as man without high school degree and single and don't have a job. Now, importantly, some data scientists have argued that these factors aren't as important as others. And in fact, age and dirty data play a larger role than these race-based proxies. But this doesn't quite exonerate Compass, because given the over and under policing of certain neighborhoods in the US, dirty data and age at time of arrest are proxies for racism, if not race. So to read against the grain, what Compass shows us is how racism persists as a systemic problem. Because crucially, Compass was initially part of the promise of AI that I started by discussing. So Compass was actually introduced during the Obama administration as solving the problem of racism by eradicating individual human bias. So as many of you are probably aware, sentencing varies with a judge's circadian rhythms. This is why good trial lawyers always try to schedule a trial in the early afternoon, because you're far more likely to get a harsh sentence if you go before lunch when the judge is hungry, right? So there are many individual idiosyncrasies to judging. But so the idea of Compass was to get rid of individual bias. And in particular, it was presumed that if you get rid of individual bias, you get rid of racism. This presumes that racism is an individual problem and that somehow pretending that racial markers don't exist solves the problem of racism. So Compass made things more consistent. It got rid of individual bias, but by replacing individual with institutional bias, which means to read against the grain, what Compass actually shows is that racism is an institutional rather than an individual problem. So what if we took these programs with all their limitations, not to predict and put in place a future that's indistinguishable with the past, right? Not to reduce the future to the past, and in particular, deep fake versions of the past, distorted, incomplete versions of the past. But rather, what if we use these as historical tools, as theoretical probes? In other words, what if we use them as we do global climate change models? And global climate change models show us a likely future based on the past, not so that we'll accept the future, but so we'll change it. And global climate change models make clear the difference between being true and being correct. So the point of a global climate change model isn't being correct in the narrow sense of the word, right? It's not to determine how accurate any given prediction is. The point is to act in such a way that we don't have to verify these predictions, right? The point is not to produce this graph. So when a model shows a 2% increase in mean temperature, we seek to fix the world, not the model. And this arguably should be our reaction to COMPAS. Rather than fixing the program, we should try to fix the world. And COMPAS shows us how racism works through age, education, employment status, and over and under policing. But the problem, of course, with global climate change models is that we've known they're true for a long time, but nothing's happened. Which raises the question, do we really need more models? Right? For whom is global climate change news? How can we avoid producing models that document the obvious and serve as alibis for action, right? So that model building doesn't become a form of ethics washing. Because ultimately what we need to do is to create and resonate with the different worlds and networks and models, different worlds, networks, and models that engage the richness of relations and knowledge unfolding around us. Not by ignoring the past, but listening, as Kara Keeling calls on us to do, to the worlds, for the poetry, the refrains, and the noise a world is making, right? So again, thinking through the complexity of not only the past, but the present. But how can we do this? Well, I want to conclude by returning briefly to the housing study that coined the term homophily. They didn't just coin the term homophily, they also coined the term heterophily. And they didn't presume homophily to be true. They were actually skeptical that birds of a feather always flock together. And they asked, when is homophily or heterophily true? And they found that status homophily in general wasn't absolute, except in terms of gender and race. And they hypothesized that this observed status homophily was actually due to what they called value homophily, so the sharing of values. Now, to prove this, they concentrated on the over-selection of white liberals and white illiberals as friends, where friend equals 3 of your closest friends, and where liberal means that you believe in biracial housing and that folk in the housing project get along, illiberal means you believe the opposite, and ambivalents don't believe that housing should be biracial, but that people in the housing project got along. Now, to make this point, they threw out the responses of all the Black residents. Right? So they threw out the responses of all the Black residents because they said there were too few illiberal or ambivalent Black residents with friends in the project. And in their subsequent analysis and models of friendship formation, they also ignored all the white ambivalents. And the white ambivalence was actually the largest category of white residents. And they ignored them because in their model, ambivalents were considered to be unstable or temporarily uncharged. It was viewed that they had to become liberal or illiberal. Now, unfortunately, they couldn't prove that this was true. They only did these interviews once. And so they openly speculated, right? So to prove value homophily, they left demonstrated fact for acknowledged conjecture. Right? And so they posited a reward frustration model in which common values make social interaction a rewarding experience, and the gratifying experience promotes the formation of common values. So this is all speculation. They also never published the data for the study of report. And indeed, the data for this report was later used as evidence for desegregation. And the report was written by Merton, Patricia West, and Marie Yehuda. And the actual report shows us that the over-selection of illiberals in real numbers also wasn't statistically significant. So that number should have been thrown out as well. And that Black and white residents did have friends and acquaintances of the other race. And that what mattered most to friendship formation was who is your neighbor, Because remember, Hilltown, which was Addison Terrace, was biracial. So the buildings and complexes were separated by race, except for one which was separated by floor, and this was the building with the least problems. So what homophily does is erase most of the world we live in, right? So different species of birds do flock together. And how many of you know people who are heterosexual? Well, in the world of gender homophily, and gender homophily is usually considered to be absolutely true, heterosexuality itself is considered a miracle, right? So is electricity, which goes from positive to negative. And here you see a model that Karina Albrecht, who's a brilliant PhD student in the Institute, produced when these connections were added back. But we're not just interested in heterophily, because heterophily too has its limits. What we're most interested in is rethinking gaps in indifference. Because to come up with the term homophily, to come up with this network of friends, they again ignored the responses of Black residents, as well as white ambivalents. But these residents and so many others lie within these white spaces that make these network connections possible. And without them, there would be no connection. Without gaps, there is no network. So the question before us is, as we seek to create just and sustainable futures, is how can we engage with those who remain, those whose stories do not need to be uncovered because they're foundational? How can we think truth beyond repetition, history beyond homogeneous empty time, learning beyond ethical tech? Thank you.
Chun, for your very, very insightful and enlightening talk. Okay. Right. I think, you know, one of the key word here that is the term correlation. We tend to, I mean, tech or AI, as well as human beings, tend to rely on this term to proceed with any kind of social interactions. But in fact, it is actually deeply influenced. This behavior, guiding principle for behavior, is deeply intertwined with social engineering, and so Professor Wendy Chun's reminder that we need to go beyond the model to look for the gaps, so that we can use the data that we collected as historical tool to address the problem of the real world, to fix the world rather than model. I think this is the one of the major lessons that we need to we have learned from Professor Chun's talk, and I especially admire the very poetic ending of the talk, where Professor Chun says that we need to value history rather than homogeneous empty time. Okay. Now, floor is open. Any questions from the audience? If not, we have already a question from one of our online audience. Okay, we have questions here.
Thank you, Dr. Chun, for your inspiring talk. And as you were saying, you trace the effects of echo chambers to the socio-cultural history of segregation, homophily, and social engineering. And I was thinking of what you wrote about new media involves the rhythm of crisis and habituation. And do you also see a connection between this rhythm and maybe the past and future, or the history or the circumstances of Second World War or post-Second World War, or pandemic or the post-pandemic era? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. Yeah, I think that question of rhythm and crisis and disruption is absolutely key. So in the book, and you're referring to the Updating to Remain the Same book, I think about the ways in which crisis disrupts habituation, but the ways in which new media relies on crises and oscillates between habituation and crisis. And I think that what this does is also get us thinking about the other temporalities of new media and engagement, because it's not simply this really strange notion of homogeneous empty time or linear time that's embedded literally and graphically within certain forms of validation in machine learning. There's also this engagement which always returns us to moments of crises and disruption. So the answer can't be simply disruption or crisis, or the moment of crisis, which then comes and reframes us, but understanding how we're living through a time in which we have this sort of algorithmic imagination of homogeneous empty time and this lived experience of crisis actually causing each other. Because it's that precise notion that the future must repeat the past, which causes continual crises.
Okay, okay, great, thank you. Any other questions? Okay, please. Would you identify yourself with?
Oh, I'm Guo Shijie. Right now I'm a PhD candidate of management school in National Senior Science University. Yeah, and my question is quite simple. That you say that. Sorry, I check. Okay, my question is that. What is your idea that if the technology can identify the gap, what do you mean the gap or not? If yes, or no matter it's yes or not, what is the role of the material and the human? Yeah, that's two questions about that.
So let me see if I understand your questions. One is, what is the role of the material in terms of the network?
Yeah. My question is that, do you think that technology can help people to identify the gap, or as you say that today, it is only the technology is only, especially artificial intelligence, is only to identify the pattern of the model of the past record or past, I mean, the behavior. So if the technology can help us to identify the gap, including the social gap or whatever technical gap, then what will be the relationship between the materiality and the human agency?
Right.
And if not, what kind of relationship is that?
Right. Thank you. So I think that there's a lot of work, of course, being done in speculative machine learning, right? Attempts within machine learning itself to get around these notions of prediction by either, you can think of adversarial neural nets, you can think of various ways in which speculation and trying to come up with something different has been embedded. And these are often used to reveal things not only that are assumed, but allegedly to chart out different ways of thinking. And some artistic engagements with artificial intelligence. And here I'm thinking of Beth Coleman's work that's trying to bring together Octavia Butler and certain forms of responsible machine learning. Again, thinking through responsibility and responsiveness in this very sort of classically deconstructive sense of one responds to the other. And what that can emerge, what can emerge through this responsiveness. So there's been a lot of move to go towards the speculative, and I think that's important. But for me, this move to think through the speculative isn't something that necessarily exposes the gaps, but rather one that dances around the gaps. Because one of the points that I'm trying to make, and it's interesting, so I was talking to Alberto Barabazi about this, and I'm saying, well, gaps are what makes the network. And he's like, yes, Wendy, you're correct. It is the gap which makes the network. You can't have networks without this filling of the gap. And the point is that these gaps are never empty. They're filled with these other social actors and conditions. And one reason why I'm trying to think through the shape of the gap and the ways in which the shapes of these gaps produce these networks is because if you go back to some of the initial studies, what you find is that if these patterns repeat, and they do, it's not necessarily because what's been discovered is something that's eternal and unchanging, but rather because the conditions of social engineering and the conditions and certain constraints themselves have been repeated. And so I think in order to think that way, you have to think through the conditions from which these conditions emerge. And for that's profoundly material. That is always about the material conditions from which what appears to be connections emerge.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Wendy. I think we can see as people who work in the humanities, especially in the English department, we can see very clearly the critical theoretical background that's enabling Professor Chun to do all these critiques, because from the very beginning, this what she calls upon us to do is to engage with the default, and that's clearly from at least partially influenced by Foucault's denaturalizing or demystifying what seems to be natural. And so once again, Professor Chun proved to us that the humanities, the training in the humanities, is a really powerful, at least a helping hand for a critique, for social critique. And I especially actually like the idea of humanities washing and ethics washing. I think very often, people in the humanities just consider themselves kind of marginal to everything that's happening. And so when we are called upon to help with the ethics, we are so happy that sometimes we just play a kind of a decorative role, and that would end up to be a work of only humanities washing or ethics washing. But what Professor Chun alerts us or reminds us of doing is that we should become an essential part of this whole project of a sympathetic critique. I mean, we do a sympathetic critique, in order to be an essential part of this this work to deconstruct, let's say, social engineering. So, any other questions from the audience? Yes, please, Professor Zhao, from our department, from the English department.
Hi, I'm Professor Chun. Thank you very much for your informative and insightful presentation and talk. My research interest is in Japanese otaku culture and fandom and media studies. So I was quite intrigued when you mentioned the ideas of like big data or digital segregation. So I've got two questions. The first question is, when I was doing research on otaku or fans, I sort of discovered that there seemed to be a scenario which people in a certain very close group would probably thought the information circulated in their media network, or their social network, is the so-called big data. They thought so. So I guess probably the English term is something like echo chamber, is something like that. And I also found that recently, even in Taiwan, our news agencies or our media also created such kind of imaginary big data. So that makes people think what they reported is truth. It's like a majority view. But I personally am in doubt. I don't know how true it is. And I don't know how representative those so-called big data is. So I'm curious that have you ever come across any research or studies addressing the issue like that? Maybe big data or the sort of intervention of media or social media, then that creates even more segregation or even discrimination. So that's my first question. My second question probably doesn't have so much to do with your talk, but I'm curious about the phenomenon of AI art and the problem of authorship, because apparently many creators, writers, artists are becoming extremely anxious about how to define those AI art. Can they be regarded as real art? And how does the authors claim their authorship when there's the emergence of this kind of art created even by amateurs, or people who even don't know how to draw? Okay, so this probably has more to do with humanities. Okay, thank you very much.
Great. Thank you. Yes, the whole question of authorship around AI art is a huge one that gets to fundamental questions about what we consider the author to be. And I find it fascinating that, once there was a time where everyone claimed that the author was dying, now it seems that with repetition, we have actually the expansion of who we consider to be authors, who claims to be authors and who claims to be artists. And one thing that I would point out in terms of just the stakes of the art, right? So there's just one argument is simply that it's drawing on these other things to create something new that didn't exist before. And they're not simply deep fakes. It's a creative act. And therefore the question becomes, who is the subject responsible for the verb, the action? But I think that the way I would even frame this question would be larger, which would be, why has art become so privileged now? So when I was at Brown, what I was in charge of, or I was part of the Arts Initiative. And there was this view that what made the Ivy Plus schools different were the arts, right? So places like Stanford, Princeton, everyone started an arts program or ramped up their arts program, because the view was what you got that was different, that was creative, etc., was the arts, literally the arts, not conservatory based, but at the same time, a reshaping of education along the notion of art. So art itself, within and in the face of technology, has taken on this privileged position of originality. And I think that we need to think through both the privileging of this notion of originality in relationship to the proliferation of art, as well as this constant desire to produce things which are slightly different than what has existed before. So that's how I would want to think through this larger question of authorship and the emergence of the arts and certain forms of arts as the ultimate human ad or not. And in terms of your first question, I'm not sure if I understand you correctly, but what I think you're saying is that within certain echo chambers or groups, what's being portrayed to them as news or social media as produced through big data or as algorithmically produced or culled from a larger set of data is not. And what's being fed is very particular. And so the question is, how does one trust or not, or how does one think through the representation of allegedly neutral big data? It's true because it's so vast, when in essence what's being fed or read are very particular things that don't speak necessarily to either the majority or to large-scale processes. And if that's the question, I think there's a couple of things which are for me really fascinating and important, which is that if you think through certain subcultures, the ways in which something registers as true isn't only that it resonates within a certain culture itself, but rather the ways in which certain subcultures become attached to other subcultures who repeat the same thing, and therefore repetition here becomes some view of validation or truth. So, for instance, within the US, one can think of incel culture and the way in which incel culture has been linked to other aspects of the manosphere, which are very different, but they resonate and they're linked together by a real antithesis towards what they call social justice warriors. So what's key is not simply repetition across within a certain group, but a sense that something that's similar to it but slightly different repeats it. So you go, so a classic example that's often given in terms of how people, for instance, become part of the alt-right is that people start by looking up alternative medicine, right? They go and they think, I think kale is good. So they go to an alternative medicine site, they read about kale, and alternative medicine sites have been shown to be 2 steps away from the alt-right. Because that idea that one questions authority then becomes a pathway to different forms of questioning authority. And what you see is going to sites that are seemingly different, repeating the same thing back at people, one gets the sense that this is something larger. Okay, so if that's the question, one question that remains is how can we map out what's happening and understand it and get a sense of it? And this is a very complicated question, but one that is important for us to think through and think through interdisciplinarily and with policymakers. So a lot of the problem with the quantitative work that's being done now in terms of misinformation or trying to understand the scale of any network is that a lot of this information is proprietary. And so there's been a lot of move, especially within the European Union, to make information available to researchers so they can verify claims of social media companies so that a larger view is possible. Now, there's still problems with this because it still presumes that knowledge emerges from surveillance. Right? There isn't, Cambridge Analytica emerged from an academic institution. It's not as though academics is itself somehow going to solve everything. There are difficulties here. But this question of how can one assess and engage through these larger structures is key. And there are different organizations like ComScore, which don't simply scrape data, right? And a lot of academics scrape Twitter data, et cetera, but you only have access to a certain amount and it's just Twitter. But use things like ComScore, which are cross-platform and also are individual user-based, and you get a sense of cross-platform interactions. So there's a lot of work being done now in order precisely to understand how can we understand that global information exchange. But at the same time, even if we understood that global information exchange, what's also a question is, so what? So what if we understand what's captured? So what if we understand how it circulates? Does capture equal user interaction?
Okay, thank you, Wendy. Thank you very much, Professor Chun. We have a question from one of our audience online. The question goes, thank you, Professor Chun, for this insightful talk. My name is Mei-Jun Liu. I'm a digital anthropologist working at the Academia Sinica. I'm very intrigued by the ending of your talk, quote, without gaps, there's no network, unquote. So how can we rework gaps and differences into machine learning if ML is about finding patterns and rules among data? Will that be a contradictory idea? I also wonder, what's your take on generative AIs like ChatGPT or Stable Diffusion? Can they represent the possibility of AI working towards producing differences than creating segregation?
Yeah, great question. And again, that whole question of generative AI is certainly one that's at the forefront of a lot of discussions around this. But again, for me, I think that what's key is thinking with machine learning within a larger context and asking ourselves sort of what are the questions that machine learning can answer and why do we want certain answers from machine learning? Are there other places and different ways of thinking through this? So for instance, one thing that we're very concerned with and really trying to think through in the Data Fluencies project is how can we come up with a notion of learning that isn't repetition of the same? How can we come up with notions of validation that aren't based on repeating things in a training set? And part of this is what we're doing is saying, look at these programs and saying, you know, what are the problems that these programs are allegedly addressing, and are they actually addressing them from the perspective of the problem being solved? And so our approach is that we need to have larger forms of validation, which involve communities, which involved programmers, which involves people who are in education and learning, to come up with not simply better algorithms, but different ways of interacting with these programs, so that how the questions that we ask of them and what we learn from them aren't only embedded within algorithmic structures. Because again, for me, the example is global climate change, right? When we think through global climate change, we don't say we need a better algorithm, but clearly models are important for understanding or projecting what, if we change X, what will happen. But these models are also really bad at coming up with precise numbers as well. They'll give you general trends. So the actual forms of intervention are far more experimental. And I think we need to keep in mind this experimental, collaboratory way of engaging with these problems, rather than trying to have machine learning answer them for us through better forms of machine learning, even as we have to push for better forms of machine learning.
Thank you, Professor Chun. Yeah, I guess we are, getting to the end of this getting together, and I'd like to thank Professor Chun again for your very profound reflections on this technical default, and has thoroughly, I would say, thoroughly raised our consciousness as to the importance of the sociocultural history of technical default. And I guess, you know, people from any disciplines would really, really appreciate this talk. And, you know, I'll thank again for your hard work. And I hope our paths cross each other again soon. Thank you very much.